the latest on the local and international scenes, and of course we will focus on the local scene here in Egypt, all this which is mentioned in the headlines of the international press. First of all, I would like to welcome my guest in the studio, Mrs. Nada Barakat, journalist. Mrs. Nada, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very well.
And we will begin with the first headline from The Guardian, and we read, Egyptian elections, Isham says opposition amid calls for boycott. Mohammed al-Baradei of National Salvation Front says he will not join poll deception after Hamdin Sabahi withdrew last week. Two leading Egyptian opposition figures have called for a boycott of the parliamentary elections, saying they refuse to legitimize a sham process. Mrs. Nada, if we start by saying how do you see the calls to boycott these elections, especially that this boycott, it deprives many of having to express their opinion as it should be after the January 25th revolution and on our way of building democracy.
Okay. I see it as a stand for the National Salvation Front and for the liberal wing, that they know that their voice was never heard as participants in the electoral process. So they think, or they see, that the best situation for them is to declare their situation out and clear, because in the poll boxes their voice doesn't show.
Yes.
This is how they are differentiating their status and their stand of the situation. Might that not be very politically smart, because it affects that the Islamic political wing always wins, and they don't have a very good ratio of representation in the parliament. But this is the way they know they want to play it. This is their situation and they stand on it. And actually that's not really a negative stand, because it clarifies their situation on it, and they clearly state it. That's it. To later on to take off the blame whenever something happens and someone accuses the parliament of being inefficient or not effective. They say, we weren't really part of it, we didn't really call for it, as they did with the constitution.
This is a very passive way in dealing with things, because they could organize themselves and they could participate in the elections to ensure that there is transparency and full participation, because the turnout is very important in order to have a parliament representing everyone, because we could not blame anyone in this case that the parliament is not representing most of the people.
The stand on this is really not as you see it. It's not as passive as you see it. It's somehow passive and not being politically active, but they have a perception that the electoral process was never integral and the ballots are not really clear and the poll boxes are being replaced, so they don't really trust it, even with the supervision of local and NGOs.
But of course they are not to blame anyone in this case.
This is why they are declaring their situations far ahead of things, to declare that we're not really part of this charade and we're not really playing part of this play. This is not how we want our country to develop, because they were clear on it during the constitution elections, and eventually they were clear. They tried to gather people, to gather public opinion, and they failed, because they believe that there was some violations with the electoral process.
This brings me to the same situation which took place during the drafting the constitution and the Constituent Assembly, because most of the people withdrew from it, and then they said that the Constituent Assembly was not representing most of the sectors in the society.
Yes, that happened. Actually, that would remain the game as long as there is no agreement of how to play the electoral process. And sometimes the President Morsi or the people in power, when it was even the Supreme Council for Armed Forces, they are always rushing the elections without real preparations for gathering people and for identifying where people lie. And they don't clarify the zones of people preferences. Actually, there's whenever it's rushed, there are like undefined lines of where people stand.
And then now we will move to another headline from the Washington Post, and we read, workers protesting fuel price hike block railroad tracks to Cairo. Thousands of brick workers blocked railroad tracks from a southern city to Cairo for a second day Sunday